Okay, so for this video I'm just starting out with the back of an old frame, so just the MDF panel on the back of a frame. I'm just doing this as a quick sketch, and I just like to do these little sketches and these little tutorials on this wooden panel. To start off, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use this 1-inch flat brush, and I'm just going to prime the surface with some gesso, and I'm using the acrylic gesso from System 3. It's the acrylic primer, and I'm just coating it in gesso just so I can give myself a blank canvas to work on. So you can see underneath that my How to Paint White Fur painting was there. I'm now getting rid of that. I don't feel too attached to these when I'm doing on these wooden boards, as opposed to doing them on canvas or paper, which I'd feel a bit more attached to. So I'm just giving it a bit of a block in just to cover it in some white, just so that I can start from scratch again. I'm just being very rough with this, not bothered too much, and I've just taped the edges to give me a nice clean edge when I remove it, just because I like using masking tape like that. Okay, so the colours that I'm using are ivory black, ultramarine blue, burnt umber and titanium white. These are the colours that I'm just going to stick with, so I'm going to keep it as a basic colour palette for now. So I'm going to start by just doing a thin black wash of my gesso, just to set the base. I'm not actually going to use a reference photo for this, I'm just going to try and make it up, but hopefully I can show you how to paint realistic black fur quite effectively, quite quickly, and have it look quite textured and quite 3D and quite thick. Exactly what we want in a realistic wildlife painting. Okay, so there is our base done. What I'm going to start with is this number 8 filbert brush here, and I'm just going to start to block in some of the basic shapes of this fur that I want. All I'm going to do this is take a little bit of my black with a touch of my brown, a tiny little bit, and just mix it together, and then add a drop of white to that, just to lighten up a fraction. And all I'm going to do, let's go a little bit lighter than that. So a little bit more white, probably a little bit too white really, but it doesn't really matter. I'm only doing a block in. But you can see we've got this nice sort of warm grey colour here. And all I'm going to start to do is block in some strips of fur, just thinking about some shapes. Not really thinking too much about the colours at this point, just making it look a little bit more interesting, adding some shapes, adding some structure, just in the general direction that I want this fur to go in. I'm not being too uniform with the shapes that I'm creating, I'm just having a bit of fun with it and just mixing them up, making sure to curve them off in different directions. Just gives that sense of variation that we see in real life. Don't make it too uniform, and just block in some of those basic shapes. I recommend using a reference photo really, but for my purposes it doesn't really matter. I'm hoping you can see the differences on the screen, because in real life there's quite a lot of variation here, but you might not be able to see them as clearly as I can. So we've started to get a little bit of texture there, a little bit of fur detail. What I'm going to do now is, just because I didn't think it was quite dark enough, in some areas I'm going to paint in some more black. Okay, now you're going to want to let that dry, but I'm just going to carry on working over the top, but letting it dry is always best. So again, I'm going to take more of our black and some more of our brown. I'm going to mix up a little bit more this time, so I want a little bit more black and a little bit more brown. And then we want an even lighter grey this time, so add more white to our mix. And just adding a little bit of water to that mix. We want to create this nice, almost half watery, half paint textured mix. And what we're going to start to do is start to block in some more of those detailed strands. So now we're going to start at the base of the fur and work our way up. So we're going to start at the bottom. And all we're doing, again, just thinking about some interesting shapes of where we might want that fur to be. It doesn't matter if you're going over those black marks that you've just put in. Having those layers, having that little bit of variation makes it much more interesting for the viewer. So you can see I'm not really paying too much attention. If I was doing this for a real painting, I'd be paying much more attention to the direction of the fur and where the fur was clumping together. But for this, I'm just trying to make it up, just trying to make it look interesting and just trying to have a little bit of fun with it. Okay, so once I've got that basic structure in, what I'm going to start to do is build up some detailed fur and detailed strips. And to do this, I like to use a dagger brush, which is this one here, or sometimes called a sword liner. So to start off with, I'm going to bring back some more of that black just to break up some of my strands of fur and just to add a few more bits of detailed fur into my piece. So all I'm doing is just using this dagger brush in exactly the same way as that round brush, just adding in some darker bits which will help me with my layers later on. I don't mind using pure black for this because we're going to glaze over it later, and we're actually going to add a little bit of colour to our fur later on. What I might actually do is leave a little section so that you can see each layer as we progress through and you can see how the painting changes. So I'll just leave this top left hand section as it is, just so that you can see how the painting evolves over time. Okay, so we're just adding those black lines in just to break up those big clumps of fur that we did earlier, just to make it look a little bit darker. Okay, I'm happy with that so far. What we're going to do next is add some highlights. So we're going to take our white, mix it in with our grey to make this slightly lighter grey colour. And what we're going to start to do is just pick out some slightly more detailed parts of the fur. So these areas where we had our clumps, let's start bringing out a few more strands of fur. We can add some extra ones as well. Just trying to add a little bit more detail. We're actually going to knock all this back with glazes as well. So don't worry too much about it looking too white or too bright at this stage. So we're just popping those details on. I'm doing quite long fur. I don't really know what fur this animal would, but this fur, I don't know what animal this fur would actually belong to. Sorry about that. Because I am just making it up. Maybe a black wolf or something with long fur. Just adding some loose strands just for that little bit of variation. And I'll leave this bottom left section here just so that you can see the difference between the two stages. Okay. Now I want to add a little bit more white to my mix, just for an even lighter layer. And I just want to pick out the areas that I think will be the brightest. So just the tips of some of these strands. Just picking out some areas where I want these highlights to be slightly more prominent. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect. We're just doing a little practice piece here. If I was doing this really, I would be paying much more attention to where those highlights were appearing and making sure to get them in the right place, or as close to the right place as I could possibly be. Okay, we'll repeat that one more time with some even lighter paint, so taking some of our white into our mix. And we're doing it quite watered down, so it's quite translucent, quite transparent and quite see-through, so it blends nicely with the colours underneath. And again, we're just picking out little details that we want to stand out. Okay. So what you're going to want to do now is let this dry, be as completely touch dry as you can get it, because what we're going to do next are some acrylic glazes over the top to adjust the colours, adjust the shadows, and just add a bit more depth to this painting. Okay, so now that's completely dry, what we're going to start to do is do a little bit of glazing. And usually with my glazes, I want to add a little bit of colour to my piece. So let's just make a very sort of bluey grey colour here. We can even add a little bit of brown to it. And just by adding these touches of colour, we can really improve the realism of a piece. So this has created a nice sort of purpley blue colour. And all we're going to do, really watered down, is we're just going to glaze over the top of what we've just created. Just to add a little bit more colour to the piece. Again, remember to do this when it's completely dry. If you don't do it when it's completely dry, you will pull away some of the painting underneath. Which is what I've started to do, very stupidly. So we'll just add in a little bit of that colour. Usually when I'm choosing the colours, I'm looking for the colours in the environment around the animal that I'm painting. With white fur, the colours that you see in the environment, the colours that you see in the fur, are reflected in the shadows of the white animal. Whereas with darker fur, with darker animals, the colours that you see are actually reflected in the highlights of the darker animal. So we're just going to put in some of those colours. I'm not too fussed about the fact that we are losing some of the details because we're going to put them back in later on. Okay, next up we want to add a little bit more of that darker black again. And again we're going to do this in a glazing technique. So we're going to use those very watered down thin paints. If you don't know what glazing is, head over to my YouTube channel. I've got a full video on how to glaze so that you can watch that there. And I'm just going to add some darker areas back into this piece. Okay, and we're going to get our detail brush again. And now we want some light blue colour. So for things like tiger stripes, a nice light blue colour in the black stripes can really add a whole new dimension to your piece. So just by adding a few coloured stripes or coloured strips of fur everywhere, it just adds that little bit of realism that I'm assuming you're aiming for. Okay. you'll just repeat the process that we did earlier, just adding slightly more white or slightly different tones and colours to your piece. So let's add a little bit of white and a little bit of brown to what I'm creating here, just to pick out some more of those highlights. You can see it's not purely grey, there are some other colours mixed in, and it just adds that little bit more to the fur that you're trying to create. In some areas you could go really saturated, so we could put some really saturated blue in there if we really wanted to. Let's knock it down a touch with a little bit of the grey colour, but we could go really saturated with it. We could make it really blue looking. In other areas we could use some brown fur, so it may not necessarily be a cold environment that the animal is in, it could be in a warm environment, in which case we'd use brown. So let's do an area of some browner fur. And you're basically just picking up those areas that are going to be hit by the light, those bits that are going to be shinier on that animal's coat, the bits that are going to be picking up that light, those highlighted areas, and they are going to be relatively saturated. If you feel like you've lost too much of the black, just go back in with some of that black paint. And just bring back in some of those darker lines and those darker marks anywhere where you want them. And then just in those areas where you want really shiny bits, start to add in some lighter colours. It's usually a better idea to let the paint dry between each layer, but I'm just trying to do this just to demonstrate my process, just so that you guys can get an idea of what I do and my thought process when I'm painting dark fur. You could do this with green, if it's green being reflected in the environment. You could do it with red, you could do it with blue. It doesn't matter what colour you're using. I am just using brown for this and a little bit of blue, but you could do it with any colour. And the final little bits that are really going to be catching the light, you just want to pick out with a small detailed brush. It's much easier if you follow a reference photo, because you can see exactly where those highlights are supposed to be in your image. I'm just making them up, which is why it may not look as realistic as it possibly could, but we're just picking up some of those finer details, those finer highlights, with a colour that can be seen in our background. A colour that would be reflected in the highlights of that black fur. And really, just to finish it off, we'll have some final really light highlights. Just a very, very light grey that's mixed with your environment colour, just to finally pick out the absolute brightest parts of this fur, where that environmental colour is really being reflected onto the surface that you're painting, onto the fur of the animal that you are creating. You do need to pay attention to the form and the structure of the animal you're trying to paint though, because the light will appear differently and appear in different regions of the body depending on what animal you're painting, depending on the light, depending on the way that that animal is facing. So it's really important that you don't just make it up like I'm doing. You actually study that reference photo and you put these highlights, you put the details in where they're supposed to be, following that general trend, rather than just making it up like me, because it doesn't look quite right when you make it up. It doesn't look as realistic as possible when you make it up. It looks much more realistic when you follow your reference photo and you study that reference photo and you try to establish the form and 3D structure with your details rather than just trying to paint details, which is what I'm doing here. And again, to finish it off, I always like to add in final few black strands just back into my piece, just to really reinforce that this is black fur that I am painting. And well, yeah, there you go. I have the first stage over here which is just a black blocking followed by a lighter grey blocking as well, just to establish the strokes. Then I will use that sword liner over here in this corner, which is where I just use that sword liner to add some thin black strokes back in. I will then have my third stage over here, which is where I use that sword liner to start to establish more shapes and more structures and add finer details in with that thin brush, going gradually lighter and lighter with each layer. Then I have number 4 up here, which is my final stages. Sorry, this bit isn't dry just yet, but this is where I do my glazing. So I'll add some colours and I will add further details with dark and light colours depending on what I need. You can follow this process with whatever fur you're painting, whether it's short fur, whether it's long wavy fur like I've done here, but you just need to remember, if you're going for a realistic look, you need to incorporate colours from the environment in the highlights of the fur. One thing that I like to do that's just a nice, really easy and simple way to actually improve my paintings is when I'm painting tigers, because they have their black stripes, I will like to incorporate a sort of browny, purpley, bluey colour into the highlights of the black stripes, which just enables me to further reiterate the form of the tiger and make it look more 3D and make it look more realistic, because those black shapes don't just look like flat black marks, they look like actual fur. So the biggest thing with the painting black fur is to reflect the environment in the highlights. And that is my biggest tip. Make sure you're looking at the colours, make sure you're looking at the direction of the fur, but make sure you're incorporating the animal that you're painting into its environment by reflecting some of those environmental colours into the highlights of the black fur. If it's white fur, you're reflecting those colours into the shadows, but black fur, you reflect those colours into the highlights. So into the brightest parts of the fur. Don't just use black and white paint. Make sure you're studying those colours. You'll see greens, you'll see reds, you'll see purples, yellows, browns, blues, everything. You just need to look closely enough.